Beyond Economics and Back. Tinklalaidę rengia Lietuvos Laisvosios rinkos institutas. Hello, welcome back to the podcast Beyond Economics and Back. I'm Elena Leontieva, the president of the Lithuanian Free Market Institute. And today it is my pleasure to welcome Phil Magness to Lithuania and to our podcast.
Happy to be here.
And Phil is a senior fellow at the Independent Institute based in California, United States.
Yep.
Philip, we are now at the spot of a former dairy factory in Soviet times.
Yes, yeah.
And I can prove that it looked very, very different than it looks today.
Don't see any cows around, so...
Yeah, I know that you have published the book, The Best of Karl Marx. I guess it is very interesting for you to visit a country which is so prospering after 35 years regaining independence from Soviet Empire and walking away from Karl Marx. Why Karl Marx is so popular still?
Right. And sadly, he's on the rebound. And we've seen this, 35 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, his reputation is being rehabilitated. Even though you would think that the track record of the 20th century is one of the most disastrous economic systems in human history. Not only in the ruin it causes, mass starvations, famines, death, but the track record of Marxism as an economic system, it just does not work. And yet here we are seeing headlines in major newspapers that celebrate Karl Marx as if he has something to tell us today. And I argue against that. I argue that actually Marx's reputation was a product of that very same Soviet system that imposed him on the world.
So he was not as popular or even as known as an intellectual in the 19th century?
That is exactly the case. So Karl Marx, we have this this weird perception of him as this great figure of the 19th century who diagnosed poverty and bad conditions in the factory and really uplifted the workers and caused all these social movements. The reality is he was an obscure figure on the extreme fringes of the political left, living in exile in London for most of his adult life. But I like to use this quote. So the historian C. Northcote Parkinson wrote an assessment of the British left, and he says, Karl Marx was not even important enough to attract the notice of the British police. So he died in obscurity. There are about 12 people that show up at his funeral. And of course, it's Frederick Engels is there, and Engels is saying, Karl Marx is the Darwin of the social scientists. But no one else took him seriously. No one paid attention to him. And it's not really until 4 decades later. So he dies in 1883, just lingers in this relative obscurity as like a second or third tier socialist thinker, only followed on the political left among other socialists and people who study socialism. But he was in competition with all these other socialists in his time. And some of them are we know about today, others are obscure. So Pierre-Joseph Proudhon in France, Ferdinand Lassalle, who's in the Prussian Empire, Johann Karl Rodbertus. These are not well-known names today, but in their own time, they were competitors to Marx, and Marx feuded with them. He hated them. He called them names. He denounced them. But they all had their own little movements, and they're in competition with Marx, but it's on the extreme periphery of society, and no one even really pays attention or knows his name until a major event. That's 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, elevates him from this second or third tier figure to one of the leading figures of the 20th century.
Yeah, he was really the main inspiration for Lenin,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
And you studied Marx because of your scientific curiosity. I studied him at the university because it was a part of the provisional program. But many students, I would say, they didn't take him seriously. Yeah. I decided that I have to read the Das Kapital and make even my notes, mm-hmm. and I think it helped me later in my economic research.
Absolutely.
So what is your take on his intellectual contribution as economic historian? What is his contribution to the history of economic thought?
Yes. So I will quote John Maynard Keynes, who's very much on the left, very much not a free market guy, but he was asked to review Das Kapital. And he says, it's an obsolete textbook of no interest to the modern world. But he was reflecting a reality at that time in history.
Which year was it?
This is 1925.
25.
So right after Lenin takes over, he said, this is an obsolete textbook. And he said its followers treat it like it's a religious book, where the word of Marx is handed down. But he says it's not economics. And there's a reason for that. He's not just being dismissive. He is pointing out the fact. So Marx writes Das Kapital in 1867. They printed about 1,000 copies. Nobody read it. Marx thought it was going to be this great work, and then it's just ignored. The real mainstream of the economics profession moves past it within 4 years. So 1871 is the Marginal Revolution. It's when Karl Menger and so Walras is a little bit after that, and then William Stanley Jevons. All three of them come together and they challenge the labor theory of value, which had been the conventional assessment of how value is instilled in an object. Yes. You perform work, you improve it, and therefore it attains value. Well, Marx builds his entire system on the labor theory of value, because you take the labor performed and the difference between that and essentially what becomes the price that the factory owner sells it at. The difference is surplus value, and Marx asserts that surplus value is stolen from the laborer. The laborer is therefore exploited, and when the laborer realizes that exploitation, they rise up and seize the means of production. They become the good proletarian man and usher in the communist revolution, essentially.
And 100 years after socialist revolution and 35 years after Soviet empire has fallen apart, people still believe very much in the labor theory of value, because it's somewhat intuitive now.
Right.
And labor is something which is visible. You know,
exactly.
People sweat when they work, but when the capitalist works, you know, no one sees his sweat, and his work, his contribution is hidden from the society.
That's exactly it. And so it's an intuitive explanation of value, but when the economists figure this out, they come up with the critique. They come up with an alternative, a subjective or marginal theory of value. And the whole basis here is they started to notice the labor theory of value breaks down. It doesn't explain certain situations. One of the famous ones, and this is hinted at by David Ricardo, even in Adam Smith, compare wine from the Bordeaux region of France and wine from Scotland. It's the exact same amount of labor that's performed to turn grapes into wine. You smash the grapes up and you ferment them and you put them in the bottle. And yet wine from France is very expensive. Wine from Scotland, I don't think anyone would pay any money for that at all. They make scotch, not wine. And they realize, well, what's going on here? Something isn't explained because the prices differ.
Yeah.
Well, and it turns out that there are other factors that are not accounted for in the labor theory of value. It's subjective personal preference at the margin, at the moment of decision, that actually determines the value. And this recognition in 1871 revolutionizes economics only 4 years after Marx writes his book. And you start thinking about it. So if you accept that the labor theory of value is flawed, subjective value is actually the correct answer here. It explains the world that we live in, not only what we perceive. Marx's book becomes obsolete.
Das Kapital falls apart.
Yeah, it falls apart.
Yeah.
It falls apart. And it has all sorts of other internal problems, but that's the major one. That's the first discovery. And I'll make this very core. Most people don't realize it. They think the Marginal Revolution is like this capitalist response to Marx. It wasn't at all.
It was an intellectual quest.
It was an intellectual quest of dealing with the issues first raised by Adam Smith in 1776.
Yeah, and never explained thoroughly.
Exactly. They didn't even know Marx existed. The first marginalist to notice Marx doesn't happen until a year after Marx died in 1884, and that is Philip Wicksteed. He is a student of Jevons, and he reads Das Kapital, and he's like, what is this weird book? And he writes a beautiful, short little essay, and he calls it a Jevonian critique of Karl Marx. And in about 5 pages, he dispenses with the entire argument and says, this is outdated. The labor theory of value does not hold. There are other internal contradictions. This book just isn't worth anything, essentially. And you get a few years after that, so Alfred Marshall is the famous, the first modern economist, according to some. You have the classical school, it's Adam Smith, but Alfred Marshall is like the instigator of neoclassical thought. He's a marginalist. And he's famous because he writes the very first internationally acclaimed economic textbook in 1890. And in one chapter, he responds to Karl Marx, and he basically says, I can't doubt that Marx cared about the poor, as we all should, but when I read his work, it's an internal contradiction of circular reasoning hidden in dense Hegelian language. And he says, it's just not economics. So that's the assessment of Marx's economics in the 2 decades after he died. It's just not a path worth proceeding.
But why the subjective theory of value is still not comprehended by the society? It still looks like something very marginal?
Yes, it is. Because it's hard to intuit. There are lots of logical steps that you have to go through a certain way of thinking. And, I think Frederick Bastiat, even though he's before the Marginal Revolution, he anticipates this very well, the distinction between what is seen and what is unseen. We see labor. We don't see choices that never happen. We don't see transactions that never happen. We also don't see the second or third best option in a transaction. We only see the record of the one that happened. So you have to really think at a deeper level to intuit why marginal exchanges occur, why at that moment. And the classic example, you're in the desert. Water is worth a lot more in the desert than it is on the street of a city where you can get it at any store. Diamonds are worth a lot more in the city, but in the desert, they're basically worthless because you could die if you don't have water. And that classic paradox, it means there's an intransitivity of value between these two products. They are worth different things in different
context. And we put this question in our economic quiz, and it's one of the most popular questions. But isn't it so, I improvise now, that people need something stable? And to understand that all values, all prices, they are based on subjective estimation of independent agents, and this is not coordinated by anyone.
Exactly.
This is difficult to comprehend, and people feel unsafe probably to live in a society where there is no stable values, no prices.
Yeah. That's exactly the difficulty here. But, I ask students to think about this all the time. Take something as simple. When you choose to buy a car, your choice in car is going to be different from mine. And that doesn't mean you're right or I'm right. You may like a green car. I like a red car. You may want a pickup truck. I want a Jeep. Somebody else wants a 4-door sedan. It doesn't mean that one of them is inherently more valuable. It means that my preferences are reflected in what I am willing to purchase. And I may pay more for the car that's the style and the color and the type that I want than just an average person on the street who doesn't have those same preferences. And that's perfectly okay to have differences in preferences.
Yeah, and everyone, even in family, in a household, we understand that our choices, they differ, and we put different value in the same things. That's why sometimes we have kitchen debates with our partners. But getting to summarize the intellectual contribution of Karl Marx, could we say that with the subjective understanding that value is subjective, it really ruins understanding that it is only labor which forms the price of the product, and since the price of the product is not paid fully to the laboring people, it means that there is exploitation. The profit explains exploitation.
Exactly.
And the whole Marxist approach to the society
just falls apart.
And the conflict between the employer and employee, it falls apart.
That's exactly it. There is no surplus value if there's not the labor theory of value.
Yeah.
You take one away and you cannot calculate surplus value. And it gets even worse than that for the Marxists, because they determine, and Marx himself realized this in the first volume of Das Kapital, he realized that labor is both a priced good, but it's also an input to production. How do you price something that's also an input at the production at the same time without a price mechanism? And he keeps promising he's going to have a solution to this circular dependency, and he pushes it off and says, well, it'll be in volume 2. Then volume 2 is released by Engels after he died, and it doesn't really have a good answer, and it's pushed off. Well, wait, there's volume 3. It doesn't really have a good answer. Well, it turns out they discovered by the early 1900s, mathematicians tried to operationalize what he called the transformation of labor from an input to a priced entity itself for decision making. They determine it's circularly dependent. You have to solve the equations simultaneously because they relate to each other.
Everything fluctuates.
Exactly.
There is nothing
and
stable.
It becomes impossible. And Marxists actually realize this, and they're like, oh no, we have a problem. So they just pushed it aside, and they said, well, this is really a metaphor. It's not actual literal Marx. So they just changed the description. But this was known by 1906. Like the whole system is discredited. And it was so bad that the Economic Journal, which was published out of Cambridge University and was probably the leading scholarly economic publication at the time, they ran a book review of a new edition of Das Kapital in 1907. And the author of it, C. Violet Butler, and she opens her book review and says, who should tilt at a windmill such as this? This is Don Quixote. This isn't economics, is basically the message. So the whole profession had seen Marx, they evaluated him, they judged him to be in error on very solid grounds, had just very harsh critiques. It's not only Wicksteed, it is Alfred Marshall, it's in Austria, so one of Karl Menger's students is Eugen von Bohm-Weiberg, writes an entire book, Refutation of Marx, and this is seen as the final word. It's like Marxists have made their argument, they lost the argument, it's obsolete, economics has moved on.
And then the revolution happened, and
Yes.
you say that it gives birth to the Marxist spread,
Absolutely.
not only intellectual, but ideological,
Absolutely.
political. And how you explain that?
Yeah.
Was it just that traction that we will all follow what Russians did now?
Well, so Lenin is a fanatic. And he is a very devoted follower of Marx. He pores over the text of Marx, even obscure letters and everything, and is trying to find meaning, and he is convinced that Marx is right. In fact, he started his career by attacking other Marxists, claiming they were watering down the true doctrine of Marx because they wanted democratic socialism. They took the revolution out of it. That they were kind of repulsed by the violence, and they said, so by the turn of the century, people are realizing there are problems with Marx. Also, none of his predictions are coming true. He says that the laborer will continue to be immiserated by capitalism, and yet wages are rising, living conditions are getting better. So none of the predictions are coming true. So the moderate Marxists that were following him in the socialist wing of German politics start saying we need to revise our theory and just we're going to advocate for better labor conditions and shorter hours and public education and maybe government provided health care. So but it's not Marxian socialism. And Lenin says, no, you're wrong. You're taking the revolution away. And that's the split that emerges in the Marxist movement. But in the early 1900s, Lenin starts going to Marx's grave in London and basically turns it into a pilgrimage site, like a religious pilgrimage. He's obsessed with Marx's grave. When he takes over the Soviet government, he actually tries to buy Marx's remains from England.
I didn't know that.
And have them shipped to Moscow to reinterred like a saint, basically. So he's a fanatical, devoted follower of Marx, but a big part of Lenin's ideology is he believes not only the elites of society need to study Marx, but Marx needs to be the education of the masses. To be a good Soviet means you have to have read the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital and internalized it and become part of the revolution. So what does he do? After he seizes power and he's a minority faction, that uses violence and unscrupulous tactics at a time of political weakness in the Russian Empire. They had toppled the Tsar, and there's an interim Republican government, and Lenin sees a moment of weakness, and that's when he comes charging in with the guns. The Bolsheviks come in, and they're a minority group. They take over the entire Soviet government, and then through both their unscrupulous violent means they were willing to use to ensure their reign, as well as the mistakes of the opposition and some bad luck, really. The opposition loses. So now Lenin is sitting on top of one of the major world powers, and he has access to the entire treasury of the Russian government. And what does he do? He takes a big chunk of it and says, I'm going to spread Marxism to the world.
Wow. And
they create a publishing house in Moscow to translate and disseminate Marx's works.
In every language?
In every language. They go purchase all of his old archives that were just sitting in a dusty office, and they start to transcribe them and treat it as like this religious text, and then they begin basically a propaganda campaign that education begins with Marx. So after the revolution, that's what causes Marxism to start
popularity,
being noticed.
And of course it was not just an ideological attempt, because it was very much related to the plan that socialism must win globally.
Exactly. Well, and this is Marx's other major theory, is he has a theory of history, a materialistic theory of history. He says, patterns are determined between the struggle between those who have and those who do not. The haves versus the have-nots, the owners of capital and the oppressed laborers. The laborers outnumber the owners of capital, so we are destined to win, is essentially where Marx goes. And Lenin sees that, and he says, everything I'm doing has been foretold, almost like a prophet, by Karl Marx. So therefore, when we expand the Soviet Union, when we invade other countries or try to foment other revolutions abroad and try to topple their governments, and we ship all this Marxist text and propaganda abroad, we are just fulfilling what Marx has predicted.
Wow, it sounds very much like a religion.
Very much so.
And it turned into a religion. It
turns into one. And that's why someone like Keynes sees it. Keynes traveled to Moscow, and he observes all this, and he comes home and he says, these people are like religious fanatics.
And we just came here from the square where the Lenin statue used to be during 40-50 years of Soviet occupation of our country. So it was in the center of the town, the central.
And that's all intentional. It's all they want you to look at statues of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and they present it as like it's this continuum of, here's the original prophet, here's his immediate successor in Engels, and then Lenin is the successor to that. And it's like a descendancy of a religion. And it's all in the iconography, the propaganda posters. They subsidize academics in Western Europe because they couldn't get a revolution started. They tried. Soviet Union sent support to revolutionary movements all over Europe after World War I, and most of them failed. But they switched tactics in the 1920s. They start saying, we'll subsidize professors who teach Marxism. Wow. And they create these institutes around at major universities. And then during World War II, a lot of those institutes, they pack up and they flee to the United States. And they set up at U.S. universities. And it's one thing leads to another, but what it all means is that the entire intellectual edifice of academic Marxism today owes its existence to the Soviet Union, whether they like it or not.
So
that's
the
reality.
Hands are in blood.
Exactly.
It's really tyrannic power.
And you point this out to them, they don't like this, because Marxists today, they'll say, well, we aren't the Soviet type of Marxists.
Yeah. They just did it wrong way.
They did it the wrong way.
The Russians did it wrong way. We would do it better.
Exactly.
And many people, I think, they would be very scared if they would understand where the ideas come from, that they come from, the KGB special efforts, that it was not just an intellectual spread of ideas.
Yeah, and that's the wake-up call people see. So when I point out Marx's history comes from the Soviet Union, whether you like it or not, the fact that people read Marx so much today is built upon those events in 1917, not in 1867.
Wow.
He's obscure in 1867, and in 1917 he's everywhere.
And now we are 35 years after Soviet Empire has vanished, and we have a new rise of socialism in a new Europe, I would say. Yeah. Sometimes it looks like something very sophisticated, very high-tech.
Yes.
But it is still socialism. So could you help us to learn how to reveal it, how to redress it?
Yeah. So a big part, I think, is telling the story. We are at risk of losing the historical memory of the 20th century and all of its lessons. So around 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. Major academics proclaimed this is the failure of Marxism. We've seen it play out over the 20th century. Marxism versus capitalism, capitalism won, and won decisively. And yet they've forgotten, here we're 35 years later, we've forgotten what happened. We've forgotten that legacy, and part of it's all because of like a revival of let's go back to the books of Marx, even though they've been obsolete since 1871. It's really weird. It's like let's go back to this old ideology from 150 years ago and pretend as if it tells the story of today, if it's relevant today. So it's part of it's pointing out that history of where this came from, why we study Marx. The other part is I think we still need to make the arguments against the labor theory of value, walk people through the logic of why it's an error.
Yeah, and understanding the ontology of our economic surrounding, understanding the roots, why we behave the way we behave, why we exchange.
Exactly.
How our differences lead us to an exchange.
To mutual exchange,
And how it benefits both parties, right? It's very simple, but so hidden from the regular view.
Exactly. I mean, we do it, it's so intuitive, we do it on our own every time we go to the store or go to a restaurant or we purchase a service. We just intuit that this is a mutually beneficial exchange, and yet they construct this intellectual edifice that claims there's exploitation occurring. And yet their mechanism of where exploitation occurs, surplus value, isn't real. It's a false theory. Yeah. So, it's back to the basics that we need to highlight that.
And I guess the conflict itself is not just between capitalism and communism, it's between liberty and tyranny.
Absolutely.
Because communism cannot survive without tyranny, and capitalism cannot survive without liberty.
Yeah. There's a great essay by Friedrich Hayek that he writes this in 1949. And he says that even though communism always presents itself as this mass popular movement, it's never that in practice. It's always a small intellectual elite that are pushing it on the rest of society. There's no popular groundswell for a communist revolution. Mansur Olson, who comes, he's writing in the 1960s, puts even what I consider one of the best critiques of Marxism. He points out it's not in the interest of the laborer to pick up guns and try to storm the city. That's just a recipe for riots and disaster and chaos. The laborer, if anything, would free ride. And he basically says Marx's entire mechanism of how the revolution is supposed to come about is a false prediction. And that's why you always see every time a Marxist state is imposed, it's imposed by force from unscrupulous, immoral people like Vladimir Lenin. or Joseph Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao Zedong, these types. It's not an accident that every time a communist society comes on, it's imposed by somebody else. It's never a popular groundswell.
Yes, and me being raised in a socialist context, I remember, of course, that people were living through a major shortage of everything.
Yeah.
And that brought me to question how economic system should be organized so that people do not have to steal from where they work. Like here from the diary, people were stealing. I was working in a confectionery next door, so people were exchanging on the street some stealed products from confectionery to the sour cream from the diary. And everyone was involved in some gray operations, and there was. So the market was still taking some part in human lives, but it was outside the official dome. It was not recognized officially. And of course, there was the shortage of everything.
Yes, yeah.
And the propaganda and the tyranny, it's unimaginable for a Westerner. It was not just a lack of meat in the store. It was a lack of access to knowledge, to books, to truth, if I may say so. So it was, complete corner. We were all, like in a prison. And so really people at that time, no one was supporting the communist state. And still today, many people are sympathetic to socialism in a new rope, new manifestation, like the idea that maybe the state should give everyone everything. It's an old communist credo, from everyone according to your capacities to everyone according to your needs.
Exactly.
And how it is called today, Phil.
Yes, exactly. With new manifestations, universal basic income, or a state safety net for everything. This notion that the government can come in and provide goods through allocation from the state, and it's always done in an ideal version of it. It's never the reality. So, you noted under the Soviet Union, there's scarcity. Scarcity is a reality of the human condition. But there are different ways we ration scarcity, and there are different ways we improve upon and alleviate scarcity. That cannot happen when you have a centralized decision maker. So Soviet Union's a planned economy. Goods are scarce. That means they're rationed in other ways. It means a black market. It means stealing and trading illicit goods. It also means waiting in line. Your time becomes your rationing mechanism. Well, today people pretend like we can get rid of scarcity and just say, well, if the government gives everybody an income,
like $1,000.
$1,000 a month, or a sustained income every year, and then they'll just go spend it, and everyone will be taken care of. All their needs are met. This is an ideal version of how socialism is supposed to work. That's out of touch with the reality of what happens in practice, and it's that divide that always explains it. Because I can pen a utopia in a book and tell you how everything is supposed to work, but if I miss something, if I err in my book, if I don't understand the theory of value, as Marx didn't, if I miscalculate how politics are going to intrude upon my universal basic income system, and it means that it's no longer this efficient thing that I've mapped out in my head as a plan. Well, it's that political reality that we'll face, not the ideal of the book version of it.
But people say that we will be more secure, the future will not be so frightening, and also the experiments that are going on, they prove that this is a great idea. We only need more money.
Only need more money. Well, it's always they only need more money.
Or no money, because as you know, the true communism was supposed to be implemented without money.
Right.
They had to compromise after several years of complete starving.
Exactly. You take away money, you create famine. Money is a mechanism that reflects prices as a signal, and prices are only functional if they are a signal that comes about from that mutual transaction. If you start to try to manipulate the price from government edicts from above, whether it's ordering a factory, this is how many cars you must produce, this is how many hammers, how many tools you must produce, there's no signal that tells the planner where to come up with that number. And the same is true if the government just decrees an income to everybody. It's a recipe for basically inflating away the monetary base. It's a recipe for spending forever and being stuck spending forever because you cannot get rid of it politically. You can't even change it politically once it's in place, because now there are stakeholders that are obtaining rents from the public. From the public treasury. And as soon as that happens, it's like a permanent program.
And they will always want more.
Always want more.
They will always go and require more.
Mm-hmm. So we pretend that we can make this efficient state. And this is one of the arguments for UBI that frustrates me to no end. They always say, well, wouldn't it be more efficient than a welfare system? And I say, in your ideal world, maybe it works out that way. In the reality that we have, we end up with not only the existing welfare system that we have, but a new one on top of it that costs twice as much and ends up just bankrupting society, because you either have to tax people more to pay for it, or you print money to inflate it away. And neither of those is good, because they're both extractive activities. You tax people more, you remove that money from productive economic uses and put it into this subsidy or this payout.
And what if robots will do all the work for us?
Oh, yeah.
This is a better argument.
Yeah. Well, if I imagine a world where I can make robots and we can all enjoy leisure, it sounds like utopia. But, what's the reality here? Where are the signals coming from of what people want in their lives? And I worry about this because there's a trade-off between a life of leisure and just pure consumption and a life of actually producing something and, trying to find the best use for the scarce resources that you have, not society has, but you have.
Yeah. And also, if I may continue, the most important part of it, that you're finding the way to serve the other. Yeah. And by serving the other, you find out better of yourself.
Absolutely.
And if you are cut from this possibility, you're done.
You destroy the signal.
Yeah.
The exchange itself, a free exchange.
The path of the advancement.
Yeah. And that there's a saying in economics, the consumer is sovereign. The consumer is sovereign over his or her own decisions. Because that's what they know that they want. I know what I want. You know what you want. You know what your needs are. I know what my needs are. The government doesn't know that. There's no central planner that knows my needs. I get to exercise decisions based on my budget, based on what I've earned, based on what I can afford. And sometimes I'm going to err in my decisions, but part of my sovereignty is I own my error. If you socialize that, you move it into the state, or if you basically just give everyone an income for no particular reason or anything created, well, what do? There's a high incentive to go spend it all on drugs and alcohol and parties.
What would you do?
Exactly.
Phil, what would you do if you get like $3,000 a month for free? Would you go on Monday to a seminar at the Independent Institute?
Right.
Maybe you will sleep over.
I'd sleep in. I'd start taking long vacations. I'd buy really expensive wine. I would have fun. I'd have a lot of party because I no longer have a drive to work if someone is just handing you free money.
And the alternative cost is a new book. Right. By Phil Magness is not written.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Or if I work in a company, a new invention is not made. A new discovery that improves the efficiency of the process isn't ever discovered because everyone's just living a life of leisure paid for by the government. And eventually it becomes fiscally unsustainable because you not only have that payout, you have the existing welfare state, you have more people consuming off of society, off of the state, than are actually producing and putting into it. So taxes either get maxed out or they have to inflate away the money supply, and then suddenly that $3,000 you were given every month is only worth $300 under the previous.
And you got used to that expensive wine already.
Exactly. But no one's making the expensive wine anymore because there's no. So it's okay.
So one Monday you will show up in the bureau again.
Yeah, and exactly, and it's just a.
But why is it so popular again? Because many people say that I know sooner or later something like that will be implemented. So I'm waiting for this. Like it's like liberation.
Yeah. Well, this is one of the things of the human condition. We imagine that we can design a world that is perfect. We imagine we can design utopia. And Karl Marx tried this, even though he said, I'm not a utopian, I'm a scientific socialist. I'm not a utopian like these guys before me. And yet he basically adopted 99% of their utopia and just gave it a new name. So utopian thinking is very, very powerful because it works in the human brain as like the society we desire, and we just have to figure out how to implement it, and then all the problems go away. But that's not the reality. We live in a world of scarcity, but a world in which scarcity can be used as a mechanism to drive improvements. You take away that scarcity, you basically take away the signals of where improvements can be made. You take away entrepreneurship. We saw this in socialist societies. They did not innovate. They were just copying. Yeah, they're stealing from capitalist societies.
And the only innovation were related to military.
Exactly. So they make tanks and bombs, and they got spacecrafts out of it, but that's a military operation.
Yes.
It's military test pilots that are going into space. But that's not real innovation. It doesn't have benefits that spill over to the rest of society. And in the militarism, it means that the Soviet Union was expansionist. It was always trying to colonize other parts of the world. And this is the real, because Lenin says we're resisting capitalist imperialism by what? Your own imperialism. And, that's the reality of it.
Yeah. It's interesting that you already mentioned scarcity, because for us, in this former socialist surrounding, studies of scarcity and lack were really instrumental to redress the utopias, to understand that almost all socialist utopias, they are based on ignoring the role of scarcity, thinking that a human mind can create abundance. But we found out that scarcity is a major vehicle, like we call it even perpetuum mobile of human life, of the structure of being, and that it is a purposeful element which allows human being to advance, to build community, to innovate, to progress, and all socialist utopias, they are based on ignoring this. And so therefore, coming back to the roots of economic theory, like we started with the theory of value, coming back to understanding how the world operates, the way it operates, and the role of scarcity there, also understanding that economic scarcity of resources is just one aspect of the overall phenomenon of lack. It was so instrumental and so powerful in revealing how utopias, how they're based on illusions.
Illusions. Yeah. And illusion is exactly right. Every socialist society that's ever been attempted or implemented, and this starts with the Soviet Union, it still exists today. The problems in Cuba, the problems in Venezuela, are what's happening in these societies. There's mass starvation, there's hyperinflation. Cuba can't keep its power electricity on. Like every couple of weeks, the entire island goes black. Why? Well, this is an illustration of one of the problems, because you convince yourself that you can create abundance by decreeing it from the state. You take away the price signals that actually illustrate where scarcity exists, but also opportunity to meet a need exists. And eventually the government bureau realizes that reality is diverging from what it promised to deliver, basically. So what do they do next? They manufacture and falsify the statistics.
Exactly.
So we didn't meet our production target, but it would look bad politically because we promised we were going to deliver that production target. So we'll just put fake numbers in. This got really bad, and the Soviet Union was notorious for this. They always had these projections that showed the Soviet Union has astronomical economic growth. It looks like it's going that on all their charts, and the reality is it's down here, just barely stumbling along on the verge of bankruptcy for decades. And it's because every year that they don't meet their targets, they falsified a number, but then the next year they have to have a higher number, and then the next year, so it compounds. And there were some economists in the mid-20th century, so one that I work on, Warren Nutter, who's a quantitative macroeconomist, comes out of the University of Chicago. Milton Friedman was his mentor and advisor. And in the 1950s and early 1960s, Nutter is commissioned on a study to figure out what the actual size of GDP in the Soviet economy is. Not the fake numbers they're publishing, but what's the reality of it. So he does this a couple ways. First, he knows production processes in the U.S. under a functional market economy. So he knows roughly what you could get under optimal conditions based on the inputs, the resources you have. And he calculates that because we know, even if we don't know the true numbers of the Soviet economy, we know what resources they had. Second, he actually goes over to Moscow on a study mission, and the Soviet bureaucrats, they take them on tours of the factory, and it's all theater. Everything's working perfectly, and it's like, this is why, Khrushchev taking the shoe, we will bury you because we figured out the model of the system. But Nutter was kind of this polymath genius, and he had a knack for picking up languages, understanding languages. Oh. And although he didn't officially speak Russian,
he understood what's going on.
And he heard the conversations in the background. So the tour guide's like, look at this, and the workers are grumbling like this machine's broken. So he starts to figure it out and says there's a divergence. And he published a statistical manual that said, here's what the Soviets claim, here's the reality, side by side. And this is the early 1960s. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, they compared the statistics, and it turned out Nutter was right. Oh. And in fact, he was overly generous on how well the Soviet Union was, even his revised statistics. But the incentive's there. You lie about the stats as soon as something goes amiss.
Great story. I have an anecdote on the same point. It's in the late 70s, a Georgian man comes to Moscow, and he takes a cab, and he asks the driver to take him to the principal. And the driver says, what is the principal? And he says, the store, the principal. And he says, no, there is no this store. And he says, but Brezhnev, under the last Communist Party meeting, he said, in principle, we have everything. Mm-hmm. So he says, take me to the principal where we have everything. Right. Maybe it's a play of words, because in principle means, just an idiom. In principle, we have everything, but in reality, we have nothing. So he didn't find this store principle with everything in Moscow. Wow. But still in Moscow, of course, the supplies were much better than in everywhere. So we used to go to Moscow to attend theaters and to buy shoes. Mm-hmm. So it was like our pre-winter tour with my mom.
So the political elite is in a society that's impoverished, and there's widespread scarcity, there's widespread lack of access to basic goods. The people who get it first are those that are politically connected. So the elite members of the Soviet Union, the leadership of the Communist Party, they're always living in palaces, and they have everything. But the rest of society is in complete poverty. So this system that's promised equality for everyone, it's equality of misery. Yeah. Unless you're a party elite.
So today is very timely to remind our audience that we don't want to go back to any promise of equality, but we want the possibility to exchange, prosper, based on our liberty and on our moral agency.
That's exactly equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. Because equality of outcome takes the pie as fixed and then tries to cut it up. Equality of opportunity, I ask the question, how do I make a bigger pie? And the bigger pie serves more people, gives them a better quality of life. I always use an anecdote of imagine you could live 100 years ago versus today. And you ask this question, almost every single person will say, I'd rather live today. And why? Better technology. We have a computer in our pocket, a cell phone. Even people that are low income have access to a computer in their pocket that someone 100 years ago didn't even dream of.
Yeah, they have water, they have
exactly.
meals.
We have clean and medicine. I mean, look at medicine. Who would want to live under the operating conditions of a doctor in 1800 where they aren't sterilizing the tools before they put you under surgery, or you don't have anesthesia, or to get a tooth pulled without modern dentistry? It's horrible.
Yeah, so we live better than kings and queens just centuries ago.
Exactly. And that's all capitalism that delivers that. And it's not a central plan. It's people finding betterment through exchange.
Oh, thank you so much. I enjoyed our conversation so much, and I hope that our audience also enjoyed listening to Phil Magness, an economic historian, a senior fellow at Independent Institute based in California, United States. And I'm Elena Leontieva, the president of the Lithuanian Free Market Institute. And please come back to our podcast, Beyond Economics and Back. Thank you.